The theme today is basically the more things change, the more they stay the same. And in keeping along with that theme, I happen to find amongst my random collection of things that I call my files, something that I wrote for the church newsletter that I was serving 50 years ago. It was the first newsletter entrance I'd ever made because I was just ordained 50 years ago. And this is from the Tar Heel Universalists. It's down in North Carolina, and it was the state Universalist newsletter, and I wrote, "It was a beautiful day in every way, but in the midst of this happy day, I could not help but reflect, if only for a moment, on the relationship of this occasion to every other event in the world which we often vainly struggle to understand. I marveled that the serenity which I experienced here was possible. The news reports we receive, the distant rumblings of chaos, had no reality here. The inflation that plagues our lives, the apocalypse that we sometimes sense unfolding, seems trivial next to the obvious fact of sharing in community, a phenomena that is supposedly in such short supply on the American scene today. We can rejoice that we can still celebrate life in such a way, and this is a tribute to Unitarian Universalism. The challenges we face must be met with acute perception and vigorous commitment if we are to continue to rejoice, because the distant rumblings will doubtlessly grow louder. With the love we have within our congregation, we can face the future together and in harmony with God and the world." 50 years ago. Now I have to do this other thing.
Now it's a time in a service where we take an offering. We know it is the gifts of all of us that help support our ability to gather and to thrive. For those attending in person, we will pass the collection plate. Randy and Sue will take those honors. Please use the envelope you'll find in the pew, especially if this is part of your pledge, or if you're making a donation. By all means, please mark the envelope with your name. For those online, links and instructions will be posted in the chat. You can mail us a check or donate through the PayPal giving page on our website. Please give as generously as you can. Our offerings will be gratefully received.
David, you want to come up and help me out? David and I have rehearsed many, many seconds for this. Merle Travis grew up in Muhlenberg County, Kentucky. And when he was growing up there, it was the #1 producer of coal in the world, not just in this country, in the world. And later, John Prine's family. He didn't work in the mines. He sang about the people who did. He had the better gig. But amongst the people who did work in the mines were his father and his brother. And he listened very closely to the conversation around the dinner table. And in many of his songs, you're listening word for word from what was said around the coal miners' table. Come and listen, you fellas, so young and so fun. And say now that you're fortune in the dark days. If you are my habit and I'll see in your soul. If the things under your heart lies black and dark as the dawn, with the danger goes and the pleasure of you, where the rain And the sun never shines. It's darkest time. Wait, there is mine. Who becomes savor his home. Well, and will have it's not and where the danger is gone. Sun never shines. It's dark. And the ages still go. I finally with them. I haven't been and I'll take my where it's dark, it's and the sun never shines. It's dark, it's done. What?
It's great.
This is a great room. You know, you talk about needing AV stuff. There was no AV stuff when this was built. Get all the AV stuff out, go natural. Go do an acoustic thing. You know, it's better for the planet. Of course, all the ministers would have to speak like me, but I'm fine with that if you are. Now, the second song I have today, I first heard in 1971 by the Byrds. But it was about a plane wreck in 1946 in the middle of California. And 33 people were killed, all aboard were killed. There were a pilot and a co-pilot, 2 immigration officials, and 28 migrant workers from Mexico. And in the article in the New York Times, it had the names of the pilot and co-pilot. It had the names of the immigration officers, and it said also were 28 deportees. And Woody Guthrie read the article in the New York Times, and he says, that's terrible. And he wrote this poem about it. And 10 years after he wrote the poem, in 1959, a college student set it to music. And it became really the last Woody Guthrie song. And shortly after that, that was right at the beginning of the folk boom, and everybody recorded it for a long time. And it became pretty well known, and that's how the Byrds picked it up. But because of that, a few years ago, a professor at Texas El Paso said, I'm going to find out about these people who died. And it took him 10 years, but he found and researched all 28 people who died in that. And there's now a monument in Los Gatos Canyon with all their names. And that monument was dedicated 3 months ago. The plane went down in 1948. And the memorial was dedicated 3 months ago. Long are history. But Woody Guthrie writing the poem, and the guy setting it to music, and everybody recording it. And he's singing it now. The crops are all in, and the peaches are ripe. The orange is pie in the green. We're flying back to Mexican border. The next all the money away. Goodbye. Goodbye. Adios, miss me. You won't have me when you be here. All this, all you can be. Some of us are young, and others now want work contracts out, and we have 600 miles to navigate. They treat us like alcohol, like us. Goodbye. Deportees.
Another singing career is launched right here at the Unitarian Church. Now it's time for our offertory hymn for the congregation. Please join us in singing number 120. It's in your gray hymnal. Turn back. Please stand as you are able.
Please be seated. Thank you, David. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate it. Are you guys okay? Yeah, you guys okay? Yeah, well, I know. I got a lot of feelings about politics right now. And I'm not going to give you any of them. And I'm not going to be that much patient if you give them to me either. Not right now. But what I am going to do is try to stand back and take a look at that arc of the moral universe. We hear that a lot over the last few years. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that was first said by Theodore Parker, Unitarian Transcendentalist, abolitionist minister, who was not welcome in most Unitarian pulpits for being a transcendentalist and an abolitionist. But that changed across the long arc of history. And he said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In 1853, in his objection to the Mexican War, that little war that gets forgotten because it's right before the big war that we had. He actually wrote that 7 years before the Civil War began, 12 years before it ended. He said that he wrote that 101 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And he wrote it 160 years before the Supreme Court struck down part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, bending it away from justice. And my conclusion is, along with Dr. King, what I call the King codicil to Theodore Parker, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice if enough folks grab a hold and pull. And the older I get, the more I realize just how long that arc really is, how long people have been pulling on it, and how other people have been pushing it from the other way. The first abolitionist newspaper, 1819. And the Emancipation Proclamation followed 44 years later. Seneca Falls, 1848, the first meeting of women's suffragettes working toward the right of women to vote. 1848, and they succeeded because the 19th Amendment was passed a mere 72 years later in 1920. Now, I'm of an age when for a long time, I thought the most significant political, big historical moment of my life was when John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. But when I look back, it may also have been the Cuban Missile Crisis just the year before. And the one that I was most actively involved with was when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in 1968. It might have been when Nixon resigned in 1974. And maybe it's now. In these days of uncertainty, I come to remind you that we have not seen the last of such days. And this current one probably won't be the last one either. And so far, I'm only talking about United States history, which is but a blip on the screen of world history and human history. Why, I remember my grandparents, when my grandparents were alive, when they were kids, there were mostly kings and queens in the world, at least a lot more than there are now. Think of how much that changed. My grandmother was born in 1900 and died in 1973. I used to think of all the change that she experienced during that time. Well, I'm older than she is now, and I don't even want to look back on the change that I've experienced. I got her beat. But the arc of the moral universe is way older than kings. Rome was a republic for 482 years. And then it became autocratic under Octavian, about like that, in 27 BC. Due to a series of civil wars amongst warring autocrats. And not long after that, Constantine combined his empire with that new Christian religion. He was a fascist before there was a word for it. He made the religion and the government one. What a marketing device. The moral universe is way longer than that, even. And I give you from the opening words, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes, it was always one of my favorite books, even before I knew that much about it. It's part of what is called the wisdom literature. And not amazingly, wisdom literature is a rather small part of the Bible. Ecclesiastes is defined, nobody really knows exactly what it means. It seems to mean sort of the leader of the group. You know, the speaker of Ecclesiastes is the leader of the group. There are linguistic elements of the original manuscripts that say it was probably written about 450 BC or around the start of the Roman Empire. But the author says he's from the time of King Solomon, which would place it 500 or 600 years before that. And as I read it, I always figured the way people do things, that it might have been written in the form that we know from 450 BC, but he was working on sayings and wisdom that had gone back much, much farther than he. It would have gone back certainly to the time when the Hebrews and the Israelites were fighting for their freedom. And then again, sometimes they were enslaving others. And then they were fighting for their freedom. And then they were enslaving others. The arc of that universe is very, 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 very long and convoluted, and people are pulling and pushing on it from every direction. My conclusion is that the arc of the moral universe is very long, and it does bend toward justice, and you do have to grab a hold and pull. But you cannot tell me with any certainty that one pull or one battle won or lost is in any way decisive. As a matter of fact, when things happen that are most surprising, that are most cataclysmic, what do they call it? An act of God. Even your actuary calls it an act of God. It's in contracts. When you can't figure anything out, it's an act of God. book of Ecclesiastes was very interesting to me as a young man, because as I read it, it seemed cynical, but it wasn't. You know, you probably have some friends that no matter what's going on, they always think the worst is going to happen. And they say it with some sense of knowingness. Oh, you know, the Mets are going to blow it again. You know, oh, you know, your person's not going to win. They don't have a chance. You know, that operation's not going to help. You know people like that, right? Well, why do you still talk to them is what I want to know. The easiest thing in the world is to be cynical. The easiest thing in the world. And it gives a sense of false knowingness. They don't know nothing. But there was that sense. Well, maybe it is wisdom. Here's some of the quotes from Ecclesiastes. When the sentence of a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. Fools are put in high places, while the rich occupy the lower ones. Look, this is something new? No, it was here already long ago. It was here before our time. Why were these old days better than those? It's not wise to ask such questions. One of the things that annoys me most is boomers who think there's no more good music. You're not paying attention. In much wisdom, there is grief. Increasing knowledge increases sorrow. And I think that's what I was reading as a young man, as I was reading Ecclesiastes. Increasing knowledge increases sorrow. You see some stuff over and over and over again. It's not that hard to be a prophet. Anybody remember Marianne Faithfull? Yeah. Oh, you guys would. Yeah, you guys don't. You don't. She wrote a hit for the Rolling Stones in 1965 when I was in high school, and I thought I understood it, and I really understand it now. It is the evening of the day. I sit and watch the children play. Doing things I used to do, they think are new. I sit and watch as tears go by. But me, you know, I don't watch tears go by all that much up there in Pennsylvania. I'm walking around out in the forest. I sit and watch the days go by, the seasons go by, the squirrels and the birds and the bees, and occasionally a bear. I meander through the forest with the dogs, and I'm grateful for my wife and family. I play guitar and sing, and I follow the tigers through good and ill. I preach a little. I get to know my grandsons. And the more I sit and watch as the tears go by, I am convinced, not by faith or hope, but by observation of what Tom Joad said toward the end of The Grapes of Wrath. He's sitting in what used to be called a Hooverville, where the victims of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, now we would call them the homeless, you know, out on Riverside Park in Manhattan. That's where they're, you know. And he's sitting there at a time when the arc of the moral universe was taking its sweet old time, bending toward justice. And he said, sometimes I don't think a man's got a soul. I think he's just part of one big one. I observe the universe as one, not two. There is no cold. There is only heat. Cold is the absence of heat. There is no 1 and 0. There's only 1 and the absence of 1. 1, 0. That's why computers work and electricity is good. And they can do that really fast, I hear. There's only 1 in the absence of 1. There is no death. You know, the law passes laws about when life begins or when it ends. You know who doesn't know when life begins and ends? A doctor. A doctor knows better. There is no death, only the absence of life. There is no hate, only the absence of love. The fallacy of duality is treating nothing like it was something. I was a philosophy major. I spent way too much time on Sartre being in nothingness. Half the book was nothing. And he thought it was something. Now, a book that was called Being, that's worth reading. I've read a few of those too. One thing that I feel I have learned by observation is that I am not the whole ball game. And the best example of that I can give is back in the 60s, I saw a concert by a guy named Ali Akbar Khan. He's a sarod player. Man, he might as well have been Miles Davis. He could, wow. He played a lot with Ravi Shankar. And he played those long ragas. And somebody asked him, what does it feel like when you're doing that? And he says, I do not know. I am not there. The consciousness I call mine did not begin with me and will not end with me. It is part of something vastly greater, beyond all words and limits. And this is not what I believe. This is what I have observed, that this is all a mask, a stage, as Shakespeare called it, for all the world, an alternatingly wonderful and terrifying, endless dance with intervals of boredom, especially if you grew up in Ohio. I am a drop of water, temporarily separated from the sea. And when I begin to speak this poetically, I know it's time to stop. As another Unitarian, Kurt Vonnegut, wrote, so it goes.
Thank you, Darrell.
I was in Delhi once. And when I was in Delhi, I was not New Delhi, Delhi. There was a group of people, about 50 people, sitting down, and in Hindi or Garhwal or something, they were singing "We Shall Overcome." So what did I do? I sat down with them and sang with them. Because I learned if somebody's singing "We Shall Overcome," sit down and sing it with them.
And perhaps we'll stand as we are able and sing "We Shall Overcome." You'll find it in your great hymnal. It's number 169, and let's hope that it's prophetic one more time. We've relied on it so many times, hopefully to be prophetic, and let's hope it does it again. 169. We're now going to extinguish our chalice, and I invite you to join me as I do so. You can find the affirmation in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. For these we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
I'm sure these words are familiar to you, but perhaps they will sound a little new or different today. Come gather round people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown. And accept that soon you'll be drenched to the bone if your time to you is worth saving. And you better start swimming or you sink like a stone, for the times they are changing. I think Kevin seems to be missing in action. I think he's had a little bit. I understand that. Okay. We can do it. We can do it. I need to have the words in front of me. Okay. Yeah, I got words right here. We got words everywhere. the Byrds turned me on to a lot of things. I won't tell you everything they turned me on to, but they turned me on to Woody Guthrie. He and Bob Dylan did. And Turn, Turn, Turn was sort of written by Pete Seeger. But what he did was he took words from the book of Ecclesiastes and set it to music. And the Byrds made it the #1 song in December of 1965. And that's the only time in history that the #1 song in the country was composed mostly of words from the Bible. And it was written by a Unitarian. I think that's a joke on somebody, but it's a good one. It's a good one. I just really like that a lot. Ready? You guys know some of it at least, so please help us out. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn. Time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to live, a time to read, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to fight, a time to cry. To everything, there is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time of love, a time of hate, a time of war, a time of peace. A time you may embrace, a time for refrain from embracing. To everything, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to gain, a time to lose, a time to rent, a time to sow, a time for love, a time for hate, a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. Thanks.
So much our service.